Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion on There's No Place Like This Place, Anyplace. My name is Maggie Burton, and I'm a counselor at large in the city of St. John's. And I currently represent the planning, development, and heritage portfolios, as well as some others such as youth and animals. And I really enjoyed watching the film and thinking about it through a planning lens. So I'm really excited to talk about it today. And with me is Lulu, who is the director of the film, and Ali, who is the producer. So I'll let you both introduce yourselves and then we'll get talking.
Great. Thanks so much for having us here. I'm Lulu, and I'm the director of the film, and I also shot quite a bit of the film as well. I was living in the block when all these events started to unfold around me, and coming from like a cinematography background, I normally like picking up my camera and filming, and so that's how it all started. And then I met Ali and convinced her to hop on the project when there was no interest or any funding whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm Ali Weinstein, and I produced this film with Lulu. Like Lulu said, I came on in 2017 and have been working with her ever since on this. And I'm super, super proud of how the film turned out. Lulu filmed a lot because she just started filming what was around her, the shopkeepers on Markham Street, like wanting to document what was there. And she just kept going, documenting herself and her partner because they were directly affected by this sale, this property sale, and the redevelopment that happened. And I'm super proud that like so many of the themes that Lulu talked about at the very beginning when she was telling me what she wanted to do, these like very complex ideas that I'm sure we'll get into a little bit in terms of the need for affordable housing and how we build cities and stuff like that. They all came through so strongly. I think, I mean, I'm biased, in addition to just sort of like nostalgia of what was there, because Honest Ed's and that block was an incredibly important landmark in Toronto, and I think pretty famous outside of Toronto, maybe, I'm not sure. Anyway, I just want to thank you guys for having us as well. It's such an honor to have the film as a part of the St. John's International Women's Film Festival, and everyone I tell who like that it's in this festival is telling me that they're super sad that we don't get to be there with you this year because it's such a great festival and such a great city, and we wish we could be there in person, but it's okay.
Great. I wish you could be here too. It would be, I watched a great panel last year hosted by the incomparable Vicky Murphy. And I wish that we were on a similar stage so I could I could do that. So I'm going to jump right into some of the things I wanted to talk about. For for starters, I guess I've never been to Honest Ed's. I was never there. I've never been in Mirvish Village. I've spent some time in Toronto, but not that much, admittedly. And being from Newfoundland, I don't leave that often. So I wanted to ask you guys, like, what was it like to be there while it was still open? I assume that you have both been in the store. And how would you describe the sort of vibe that you took away from it, and how did it make you feel to be there? And how did that maybe influence the reason that you, I guess, your decisions to do a bit of a narrative history of that block itself? And yeah.
I mean, I think it was sort of a very daunting task to try and show what Honest Ed's was, because I knew that um, if people didn't know about the store, it would be hard to create that emotional connection for them because it's such an well, it was such an important place for so many people in Canada and mostly in Toronto. Not only because it was this amazing, accessible meeting spot for a lot of new immigrants. Like, not only was it a store, but it was a physical space people could go in and like not worry about security and just like be there and feel safe and comfortable. And we don't have a lot of those spaces left anymore. And so I think, the whole immigrant like part of it and how important it was for the immigrant population is so amazing. But also it just had like the most amazing like aesthetics inside. It was just like this magical space that was like so maze like that you could get lost in. And I had been there before I moved into the block, and it was just kind of a fun place you could go hang out in and like find really weird things like Elvis busts. I remember they had a lot of these like Obama bags, like tote bags that are really funny. And like I bought so much weird stuff, but I've also bought a lot of really useful stuff from Honest Eds, and I really miss it. And it's weird to sort of go by the block and not have it there anymore. But it was definitely a daunting task to try and encapsulate very quickly the history and sort of like represent what it was. And I know like a lot of people might not have thought there was enough Honest Eds in there, um, or maybe like it was just my sort of interpretation and like my homage, but someone can make a whole entire film about the importance of Honest Eds and what Honest Eds was.
We talk a lot about third spaces such as libraries and community centers. And there was a lot of discussion about not Honest Eds itself, but the Mirvish Village community sort of anchors in the film. And those are definitely third spaces. But I'm wondering if you would consider Honest Eds a third place as well. Like, is it a place where people linger and talk, or is it a place for sort of like a more private experience? Because I guess being there and walking through is kind of like going, the way that you describe it, again, I haven't been there. It's like going to a thrift store and really enjoying sort of picking through the bins and stuff like that. But is it, do you think it would count as a third space to the people who, especially who loved it the most and who've been there, like the immigrant families who it was their first shopping experience, for example? Is it a third space?
I mean, I think what really stuck out to me was I had some friends, like I didn't grow up in Toronto, and I know that's a very different experience for people who grew up in Toronto, especially from like immigrant families who went to Honest Eds, and they were just telling like every person in Toronto has a story about Honest Eds, and that's not even like embellishing kind of thing. It's like everyone I meet has a story about Honest Eds and how their family is connected to it, or like someone like a DP I know was like, oh, my dad actually worked at Honest Eds, like, and so a friend of mine who's also a filmmaker, I think, was talking about how she remembers like being taken there by her family, and her family would shop, but they would know that they could just like let the kids run around and like feel safe there. And I think it probably was like a meeting spot for a lot of like immigrant families, maybe to hang out there, and like the turkey giveaways that they had. And I feel like there was like a sense of a community space, even though it was a store, because a lot of times people wouldn't actually like go and help you. Like you had to, if you want something, you really have to find someone to help you. And so I think that helps lend itself to just having like a physical space where people can just go and like linger kind of thing.
I think it's hard to like even explain or understand how it became the way it was, because it really was such a, like Lulu said, like everyone who is from Toronto has their own connection to Honest Eds, has their own story about Honest Eds. It's a place that like I was born in Toronto, and my parents both, went there many, many times in their lifetimes, and so did my grandparents. And so with every new wave of immigration into the city from whatever part of the world was coming into Toronto, like Honest Ed seemed to be this place where people would go, and like Lulu said, just sort of see other people from their community there at the store, and so they would linger and talk to them. Yeah, I mean, I did like a very, very short film several years ago about this poet who was an immigrant to Toronto from Grenada in the 70s, and one of his poems is about Honest Eds from the 70s, and it's just sort of like that's the sort of stature it took. It just was this place that's synonymous with Toronto for a lot of people.
That's interesting. And I understand that there, at least at one point, were some services offered there as well. My partner recalls, and I'm not sure if this is accurate, but recalls a dentist and an immigration office. So, because he spent a lot of time living in Toronto, so it's yeah, it clearly has elements that are really similar to many like places that we readily identify as a third space. And it seems like people had that impression before it was up for demolition. You know, sometimes we don't think about these places as sort of, I think it was maybe David Mervish who said that buildings have a lifespan in the same way that people do, was one of the quotes I wrote down from the film. But until the lifespan is over, sometimes people don't really think about what the impact was on the community. But it seems like with Honest Eds, it had a pretty established, like if somebody was writing poems in the 70s about it after they moved to Canada, it seems like it was always an established landmark. And I guess the title of the film, you know, there's no place like this place, any place, it becomes pretty hard to describe a place that is totally unique to anyone as an outsider. So as an outsider, I appreciate your descriptions. And that sort of like it ties into one of the other things I was really interested in when I watched the film was um, it seems like it had so many connection points in the community. So, you know, you have a family that shopped there 40 years ago and then their kids shopped there the next year. And similarly in Mirvish Village, all of these, you know, these artist spaces have so many touch points, right? Like there's huge communities gathering around the bookstore or some of the art studios. And you know, there's thousands of people coming out for the community consultations on the redevelopment of the area, and that really speaks to how many people Mirvish Village and Honest Ed's touched in Toronto. So I was wondering, I know Lulu, you filmed some of the public consultations, but how many of those sessions did you actually go to?
Um, I came in sort of later on the actual public consultations, but then I was part of like a construction committee, which was like a much smaller sort of thing that was run by the city and the developer, and people from the neighborhood would attend, and that had to more do with like what was actually happening like through the process of like the whole construction and development part. But I came into the actual public consultation a little later on, and it was definitely a process that I wasn't familiar with. And you know, through making this film, I've learned so much more about planning, and I've been able to talk to so many people in the field, and it just feels like, you know, this issue of how do we reconcile like heritage and like character preservation of like spaces, like parts of the city that we like with the fact that we're going through a housing crisis, like is a question I'm constantly trying to figure out. And also, you know, the question of like how do we get more affordable housing is one that I constantly am asking and trying to talk about. And it's funny that we're talking about this now because Ali and I just came from like a sort of Zoom session we were doing with two amazing people who work in the field, and we were just asking them a bunch of questions, and it's something that I've become so interested in, and it's something that was really cool to see. But obviously it's hard when you're making a film because you can't show like every aspect of it, and I couldn't make like the Parks and Rec version of this film.
That would have been great. Parks and Rec version of Mirvish Village. You know, I fell into the pit, etc. Um, I just rewatched season 1 of Parks and Rec last week, so it's fresh in my mind. I think one of the things that did come across in the public consultations videos that you had that I wanted to ask you about was, you know, there was a lot of economic anxiety just overall around life in Toronto. There's quite a bit of uncertainty. People were criticizing the lack of affordable housing for artists specifically, for example, in the building. And somebody said that they just wanted something that maintains the history of that space in the new development, and something that centered the Black community in the area. But there was quite a bit of a panic that I felt. Like when I was watching it, I could really feel the uncertainty and the anxiety of the residents in that area. And you know maybe not all of them are being impacted directly, but just in the general area of Toronto, people don't have anywhere to go. They don't have a house that they can buy, and they don't have a rent that they can afford as an artist. you know my salary right now is half of the median income in Toronto, so I would not be able to afford anything that was going up there. So there's a lot there, but not a lot of people in Canada actually go to these public consultations on developments until it's something that affects them personally. And you go to your first one, and there's usually 50 to 100 people that are just devastated in the room about and it's fear, it's panic, and it's and rightly so. A lot of the time people don't know what's coming, and they don't feel meaningfully engaged, and they don't have the information that's needed. And it's really difficult to do that education as well. It takes time. But I was wondering, what you think people might be able to learn from these public consultation processes, because obviously informing ourselves about developments that are happening in our cities is so critical to being to having a good civic, just a good place in the civic atmosphere. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I've actually gone to more than just for this development. I've gone to some now in Chinatown, and
Since
it's
then,
interesting.
like,
Sorry?
have you went
Yeah,
since going?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so
Like
this was your
outside of
introduction.
filming, just like because I'm
Cool.
passionate and interested about all of this now, and I think it's so interesting that the language used at planning like consultations, a lot of times it's inaccessible. It's like talking about very technical things like fine grain, like like just things that I'm like, as someone who made a film sort of about all this, like even I'm just like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. And I've had to be like, hello, like, can you just break it down, for the rest of us? Because I think a lot of people who are at the public consultations that are smaller and not like the bigger, more well-known ones are people who maybe come from the field. And so I think trying to make it more accessible to people who have no clue what's happening. I know like a lot of the development proposals are like, here's 50 pages. And it's like, people don't have time to read all this. But also I want to point out, like, a lot of the people who are able to go to these public consultations, they're people with like jobs, that like job security, like what, and like people who are working like shift work, or people who can't find um like people childcare sort of thing. They can't go to these things. I think a lot of marginalized folks, a lot of BIPOC folks can't go to these things as well. So it's like, whose voices are we being heard at these public consultations? And
The
I know
typical
that,
attendee is like a 55-year-old white man from a middle income family. That seems to be like across North America at
yeah, and
7
it's
p.m.
like
on a Tuesday evening.
people who own, are property owners, that sort of thing. And so I think that it's important for us to try and go to these things. Like I've heard from politicians and like city staff that it's like, if you want something, you have to like go to these things and let the developers know. But I'm just like, well, a lot of it, the people who I think we would want to hear the most from and are impacted the most don't have a chance to go to these, or it's inaccessible. And so I think that all needs to change. And yeah, that's sort of my thought about it. Ali, I'll pass it to you if you have any thoughts about it.
I mean, no, I don't have that much to add. I mean, I think, I came into this as Lulu knows, like very, very interested in the nostalgia and the history of Honest Ed's, which I think is like a big selling point of the film for people in Toronto. And Lulu who's always been an activist and always really, really interested in municipal issues, would be like, we gotta get this and that. And like, sometimes I'd be like, oh, this is too nitty gritty, like you're losing me. But I'm like so grateful because I learned a lot in the process and have a lot more to learn. But I think that she ultimately did a really good job of like bringing the activist issues to the fore in a way that's like very digestible, because it's also like mixed in with so much other history. And so I mean, hopefully this film can kind of capture some other people who might not have been watching it because they're interested in the issues of affordable housing, and maybe they will become more interested.
Nice. What would be your, your wildest dream or the biggest success that you can imagine for this film in terms of how people engage? Because a lot of this film was about engagement and about, engagement means so much to different people. But for me, I'm talking about like specific city-led public engagement processes or developer-led or community-led. And yeah, what would you like this film to change about it? Because we know that young people don't go to these meetings and can't go oftentimes. They have issues with childcare or anything else. And yeah, like I agree that it needs to change so that it's more inclusive. And I hope that the digitalization of meetings can actually help bridge that divide a little bit so that you can have in person and online, so that somebody nursing a baby at home can watch while they're in a rocking chair or something like that. Um, but yeah, what are your wildest dreams for success for how this changes the engagement landscape in Canada?
Um, I feel like civic engagement is hard, and I feel like getting people to organize is difficult. I think it's easy for a lot of us to read the news and complain and like talk about what we don't like, and it's harder to sort of figure out how we can feel like we have some political efficacy and like what we can do about all of it. And I think that because a lot of times they feel like very vague, big issues, it just feels like this thing that you don't know what you can do and how you can change all of that. And so I hope that the film will help get people interested and start conversations that will then lead to people learning about different organizations that they can help organize with, and like what can be done, because I think a lot of this is around like a political issue as well. And I think a lot of people don't realize the power of provincial governments and how much like municipal governments' hands are tied. But I think, COVID's been hard for everyone, and especially like putting out, like my first feature during COVID has been really hard, because I was really hoping to get to engage in these conversations IRL with people at the cinema, or on in talks, and to try and sort of like rally people up and make them feel like they want to do something about it, because listening to Ita and listening to Deb both talk with such passion, it's like, like it just really, I really hope to like galvanize people into wanting to have change happen. And I think, we almost had our dream, which was like screening the film at the Hot Docs Bloor Cinema, which is like pretty much in like right there and where the development was. And then we were gonna have like a nice little like after party get together at a different book list, which is across the street from the site. And then so you'd actually get to meet Ita and everybody at a different book list, and then like look across, and it would have been this like almost immersive experience. But like hopefully one day that'll happen. But I guess for me, I just really hope that people watch this film and use it as a starting point to really get into figuring out how do we create more livable cities, and who are we building cities for? Because like as like a queer BIPOC person, I don't want to go move to a smaller like white town, because it doesn't feel inclusive or safe for me. And so it's like, how do we create spaces in these cities that no longer feel like they're holding space for us anymore? And how do we make them more accessible? I don't know, but I hope that eventually we'll figure it out.
What about you, Ali? Do you have any wild dreams for how this changes things?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, it's just great to get the conversation started for those who watch who maybe didn't know that much about the issues. And again, like, I mean, I think I just love that in this film, I think Lulu just did such a good job of bringing up the themes of like place and the importance of place on an emotional level for people too. Like when I watch, you know, Gabor towards the end of the film talk about his legacy and the 40 years he spent on Markham Street, and then see Aita like so proud of what her community has achieved and looking to the future in this like really optimistic way. Like every time I watch, I just get so emotional. And I think that what the film does is sort of like really subtly show this really abstract concept, which is like what place means to human lives and to communities. And I mean, I once again, like towards the beginning, I almost argued with Lulu about the title of the film because it just seemed way too absurdly long to me. But it's a slogan that was like on the side of Honest Eds, and it actually is such a perfect title at the end of the day, in the sense of talking about like a utopia, or you know, a real place that actually did once exist and serve a community. Like it's just sort of all these things at once, and really like putting the focus back on space and place and what that means. And at the end of the day, that's what this film is about.
And
How it
I
changes
feel
over
like,
time, I guess, too, right? Like
Yeah,
the utopia shifted. Sorry,
exactly.
Lulu.
oh yeah, no, it's just like cities are ever evolving and changing. And I think that's like the hard thing to come to terms with, is like things get redeveloped and change happens. But it's like, how do we do that in a good way? Like, you know, like I am currently in Chicago right now, and like, you know, like they have a lot of issues, but I think they've also been able, at least architecturally, keep, you know, parts of their city where and like maintain a nice waterfront, where you look at Toronto and you're like, what happened to Toronto, kind of thing. And I realize like I get stuck in the weeds a lot, and like I'm super grateful to have had Ali on this project, because she really helped steer me in a way where it's like it's about telling these emotional stories, and then through that you kind of like understand this bigger picture, and like people can extract that from, you know, these very personal stories. And it was like trying to figure out a balance between all the information that I wanted to stuff in there, and how to create like a meaningful, emotional, interesting film. And like I think without Ali, I don't know how I would have done that. So I'm very thankful to have had that help with it.
I mean, it's always a team effort. Thanks, Lulu.
It was very a very moving film, and especially like you know I really felt a sense of like a storytelling. You know, it was moving through time, not necessarily linearly, but a lot of like sort of showing what was and what had become and what could have been, even, you know, if Amazon hadn't have been invented. I was sort of thinking last night, what did this store look like in 10 years if there was no online retail? You know, what has sort of like a global trends had to do with this? And when it comes to, I was just an interesting point about Chicago versus Toronto versus St. John's. When I think about affordable housing and what it means to have like a more regressive response to the housing crisis, it's so different for every single city in North America. That's the hardest thing about talking about this issue, is that it's so localized. So in Chicago, the vacancy rate is something like 12%. In Toronto, it's 1%. In St. John's, it's 7%. When I moved to St. John's, it was around 1% or 2%, something like that. So it's, cities that, like St. John's is an oil, is a petroleum-based sort of economy here. We have boom and bust in the same way that Calgary might. So we have, like, our downtown vacancy rate is something like 25%, I think, right now. So it's quite different than Toronto. So I find it hard sometimes to watch films about other places and really see how it applies to my own local context. But in this film, again, because it was so localized and even in one neighborhood within Toronto, it was a lot easier to see what some of the issues were. But I must admit, as an outsider, I had to do quite a bit of digging into the Toronto real estate market, just thinking about it. What does it mean to build more than buildings, as Mike Layton was saying in his part of the documentary. Supply doesn't mean affordability, but what happens when the supply is so low that, in order to have affordability, there just has to be something built. And I feel like developers can often take advantage of that vacancy rate being so low to just build something. Anything is better than nothing. And in St. John's context, getting rid of a vacant building is better than, like, whatever goes there is better than what was there before. That's the mentality, right? So it doesn't matter if it's good, just as long as it's something. And that's, I think, the thing that we have in common in a lot of cities is, like, whether you're in a depressed economic state and there's no there's no problem with vacancy rates, but there's a lot of empty buildings that are causing problems for neighborhoods. And it's just sad in terms of a pedestrian, for example, walking past all these empty storefronts. So that's a really ugly part of our current reality in St. John's. But what do you think about, you know I feel like there are a lot of things that would take hours to sort of talk through, like, what does affordable housing even look like? What does gentrification look like? I think one of the worst parts of gentrification comes with the financialization of housing as a commodity. Housing is sort of, instead of building homes for people, we build buildings that can house our investments, or we buy buildings that can wait 20 years until the real estate market bounces back, and then we do something with them. We, as, like, in general. So, what do you think? I guess, how has making this film shaped your understanding of those things? Because it's not so simple as just, we shouldn't build anything, but we should build good things. I don't know. It's not really clear to me what the answer is, but I'm interested in your thoughts after making this film, and specifically around that financialization versus building something that's good but still has profit as an incentive to build it in the first place. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that through making this film, like, I'd have one idea and then I'd still be filming, then I had another idea, and then it'd just be like constantly swaying back and forth of, like, oh, I missed this, but then we need this, and then, like, it's just like this balance of, like, how do you decide what's worth keeping? And obviously cities need to be densified and, like, built up more, but I guess it's, yeah, I mean, at the end of the film, I left it on a question because I'm still trying to figure out that answer. And I think a lot of times the answers, there are many answers, feel very, like, vague, and, like, there's, like, steps you can take or, like, things that we should be doing, but it's, like, hard to figure out what you can do as just, like, a person thinking about all of this. And yeah, I guess for me, I'm like, I don't know what can be done, but I think what is the most important thing to think about is the fact that developers need to be thinking about building for, like, the community that they're taking over, not for, like, building for another community they want to create. Like, try and, like, not elevate, but, like, like, why don't you put something better in for, like, the community that's already there, rather than trying to attract a totally different new community. And I think what's amazing is Aita's story. Like, she got a seat at the table with the developer, and instead of, like, giving up, they, were working with West Bank for a while to get a seat and be like, we are staying here and we're, going to do this. And then in the end, the city came and bought this building, which, was my building that I lived in. And now it's going to become a community center. And I just think it's such an amazing story, because most of the times when gentrification happens, like marginalized folks get pushed out first. But in this case, like they got to stay, and they're going to get to carry on the history and the legacy of the Black community in the area. And I want to see more of that. And I want to see like developers working with, marginalized folks from the community, or like people from the actual community, to like collaborate and create something, rather than like just pushing people out and trying to create a whole new community.
I wonder too, actually, like, I've never really discussed this with you, Lulu, so I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think one thing for me that I learned in the process of this is how nebulous even the terminology around a lot of this stuff is, and that affordable housing doesn't really mean anything at all. Like, it can mean whatever you want it to mean, depending on how a particular company or government body decides to use it. I mean, obviously, like there's various definitions that are sort of used, but the public, the general public, when they read a newspaper article about an investment into affordable housing, like doesn't necessarily know what definition is being used. So I don't know if there was like some way to kind of like standardize how we're talking about these issues. Maybe it would be easier for a public to discuss them and understand them, and therefore be able to advocate more effectively for what they want. And also, like, I mean, like Lulu mentioned, we just came off a Zoom with a couple of affordable housing experts for a little written piece that we wanted to do to expand upon the TV version of the film. And one idea that was brought up, which I thought was really interesting, and I'm not an expert on this topic, so I don't know how much of this already exists, but an urban planner named Cheryl Case was explaining, she's based here in Toronto, and she was explaining that so often these government subsidies that go towards affordable housing go to these like major developers who are these huge corporations that are buying these big swaths of land, and maybe one potential solution, obviously there's like many solutions needed, would be to have these subsidies going towards smaller developers if they were to exist. I mean, I think that's sort of like doesn't really exist too much right now, but like if there were a group of smaller developers working more closely with the needs of a community and advocating for those needs more, there'd be less of this sort of disparity in terms of what that money is being used for.
And I know that, for example, with the CMHC, they only require, I believe it's 5 units for a building for development in order for it to qualify for the affordable housing seed funding. I might be wrong about the specific pot of money, but there's a very low bar. And so something like, they started with 10% of the units being affordable based on the city's first definition of it. And then eventually they went up to was 366 units in total. And I believe 100 of those were geared to 80% of at market rent, and the other 266 were 30% of the median income, which means that you're spending $2,000 a month on rent. But that median, as explained in the film, is calculated by a very polarized economic landscape, and that economic anxiety that I was talking about earlier really came through even within that. But if affordability was indexed to the minimum wage, for example, then you'd have to build units that are about $500 a month to be 30% of your wages. So I think there are some really interesting ways to do that. And I know that, for example, in Canada, rental units are the least funded in terms of subsidies and things like that. So there's like the sort of social housing, nonprofit housing, city housing, whatever, because it's different in every city. And then there's the private home ownership. And both of those get a lot of support from whether it's CMHC or from the government. But that middle of like rental units is really, really, really the least supported type of housing in the country. So I heard, when I heard the developer representative talking about it was 100% rental units, and the political challenges of having rental units at all was acknowledged in the film. And that's something that I experience all the time in my job. People don't want renters in their neighborhoods. They don't want students. They don't want, they think of them as transient. And it's not like that especially in a bigger city like Toronto. That most renters that would not move out of an apartment that was great unless they had to, right? You stay. Once you get a good spot, you stay and you hold on to it for dear life. But yeah, like, how do you think we can help change the perception of like what renting even is through art, like really through this? Like, what do you think the power of that could be?
I mean, I guess it's hard to say for like the site because they're a luxury developer, and so it's like I'm sure people are like, well, if you're a luxury developer developing for like 100% rental, like who's your target demographic? It's not like people who are in like the marginalized suburbs, like when there's an apartment there. It's like it's very different. And I think that at least in Toronto there's a big shift away from like buying property because it's unaffordable, even for people who could maybe afford for like a higher rent, but they might not have the down payment for to buy property. And so I feel like at least in Toronto the trend has been like a lot of people are renting, and so I think it's more accepted, whereas I guess it's probably different in like smaller cities. And I think that in like Europe a lot of people also just rent as well. And I think what I find interesting is I think I read somewhere that Toronto once had a slogan like the city of homes or houses or something, because it had like so many single family homes. And I feel like there was like legislation, I think, in this at some point, where it was like, no, we're not going to build apartments. Apartments are bad, like sort of like, walk-ups are bad and that sort of thing. And I feel like that's what also really screwed Toronto over. I'm like,
Yep.
If we just had a lot of like 4 or 5 story, like, even 3-story, like walk-ups, like it'd be awesome. And then we'd have so many more spots. But Toronto's the place for single family homes, and here's where we're at. But
Is it too late
Ali,
for
if you
that,
have
do you
any.
think? Like, Ali, same question, I guess. Like, do you think it's too late, now that we have all these single family homes and we're desperate for housing? Do you think we can just build 3 to 5 story, like, or 8 to 10 story, even like mid-rise? You know, is it too late for that? What do you think is the future? Is it all high rise? Is it something else?
I feel like you know better than I do, Lulu. You can predict the future better than me.
I don't think I can predict the future better, but I just feel like, no one's going to give up their single family home. And I think there is this mentality, like, as someone who can't afford to buy a house, I'm like, rah, rah, rah. But I'm sure like for people who are finally able to buy a house, there's like that switch in their brain where it's like, oh, now I can like charge this amount for this. And like, like then it's like on one side you're a renter and then suddenly you switch to becoming a landlord kind of thing. And I don't think anyone's going to be giving up their single family home anytime soon. So yeah,
Wait,
I'm like, I don't know
this,
how people,
sorry, go ahead.
I just hope that, like we can somehow, take those single family homes and build them to be more like Berlin style things or something like that.
Yeah. I guess when land does come up for sale, like just recently in Toronto, like another landmark called Sneaky D's, which is like this Tex-Mex place that's been around forever and actually started right across the street from Honest Ed's. We didn't realize this. It just sort of when it went up for sale, there were articles like talking about the history of it, because now it's like at College and Bathurst, but apparently when it started, it was right across from Honest Ed's, and the name.
And the name, yeah, is like a play on Honest Ed's because it's Sneaky D's.
That's so funny.
And it's like, a memorable music venue for a lot of people too.
Yeah, so that's going to be redeveloped into condos, right, Lulu?
Yeah, I think so. Like, yeah. Or was it rental? I'm not totally sure. And I think the whole idea of condos and like rental is hard because it's like, I think most people, when they see a tower, they're like, it's a condo. And when people have written descriptions about this film, they're like redeveloped into condos. And then I have to be like, actually, they're going to be 100% rental units. And then I'm like, I mean, I guess apartments. And it's like the whole language around it is so confusing for people.
100%. Hey, I could talk about this all day. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to some of my more complex questions. The just the whole concept of what affordability is, I really hope people take away from this film that it would have to be $500 a month for somebody on minimum wage to qualify as affordable under the city's definition. And I think we have a long way to go before that's a thing. And that's really depressing to think about. But do you have any last things you'd like to say before the call is over, I guess, or this panel discussion about Honest Ed's, about the film? Anything? Any last?
I'm sad that I didn't get to go to St. John's, and I hope that one day I'll get to go. And I hope that people enjoyed watching the film and it created some more discussion. And I'm always curious about how people will perceive the film or what they'll think about it when they don't know anything about Honest Ed's, if they can still feel that connection to the building and stuff. So thank you for taking the time. I could nerd out about affordable housing and all these questions for so long because like after making the film I feel so passionate about it. So thank you for taking the time to do the interview and raise all these amazing points, and I'm really excited to be a part of the festival, so thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was really interesting to hear you talk a little bit about the state of housing in St. John's. And, I wish that we were there to talk in person with your audience, because I would love to know what other people who are watching this film there in St. John's are thinking about affordable housing in Toronto that they see through the film versus St. John's. And, I think that we'd both probably love to learn more. But yeah, I mean, I guess if you guys want to go to there's no place like this place.com, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you wanted to like make comments or ask more questions, like we really do encourage the conversation and want to be talking with your audience, even though we can't be there in person. But thanks so much for having us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'll share that and encourage people to watch it. I guess when it's I guess with the film festival, I need to look up the schedule yet, but I really enjoyed talking to you, and yeah, thank you very much. And I think you succeeded. I felt the place of Honest Ed's and Mirvish Village very strongly, and I was very sad about it by the end of the film too. Aww. So I think it was very successful.
Thank you.
Test party of one, but it's it's good. Anyway, have a great rest of the day, and look forward to meeting you sometime in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much.